Welcome to RPG Heroes, a podcast where every other week I speak to a true hero in the realm of role-playing games about their journey, their craft, and their views. As your host, I will focus on one particular aspect of this wonderful hobby for the interview, regale you with stories from my own 25 years of experience with role-playing games, and reflect on the major takeaways from the interview. Join me now on this epic journey and awaken the hero in you. On today's show, we're talking about mood in role-playing games, and in particular, the mood of horror. Well, okay, that was a bit much, but you get the point. If you're interested in exploring different moods in your games by setting, mechanics, narration, intonation, and certain external influences, then stick around. We'll also be talking to Scott Dorward, an expert on creating horrifying moods in his Call of Cthulhu scenarios. And as usual, I'll point out some great online content for you to unpack this topic even further. Now, before we dive in completely, I would like to congratulate the winner of our picture contest from episode 1. The winner is Laurens van Vliet. He has already been notified through Facebook, and the prize is on its way. He used some lovely handcrafted terrain and an awesome backdrop to create a lovely scene. So well done on that one. And of course our runner-up, Bert McKay, also did a neat job, and I especially love the background of his picture, which is that he was teaching his kids how to play role-playing games, which I think is just wonderful. So if you don't want to miss out on future contests like this, well, make sure that you like and follow my Facebook page on facebook.com/RPGheroespodcast. Now let's dig in. The mood in a role-playing game is determined by a number of things. Let's start with the actual game itself. The game that you choose to play has quite a bit of influence on the mood that you can create at the table. For instance, compare Dungeons & Dragons, which is a very well-known role-playing game, which is designed to create this very heroic, epic feeling. The characters are mechanically created in a way that makes them powerful, that makes them grow in power, in influence. It makes them grow in wealth and equipment, and it makes them better and better and better at dealing with an escalating type of conflict, which is great. And it creates an epic mood, it creates a mood of heroism, and it creates a mood of let's kick down the door and do stuff. Now, I'm not saying that every single game of Dungeons & Dragons is going to be exactly that particular mood. Certainly not, because there are many other factors. But the mechanics of the game do lend themselves very well to heroic gameplay and heroic moods. If you contrast it to another well-known game, which is Call of Cthulhu, it is almost the opposite in mood. Call of Cthulhu creates a mood of, mechanically speaking, you can have a character who can do certain things and who has knowledge of stuff, but they are fragile. And the other mechanics of the game support a feeling of an ever-dwindling supply of resources, including, your hit points and your sanity, which creates a completely different mood to the heroic Dungeons & Dragons game. In fact, it's rather difficult in the basic Call of Cthulhu mechanics to create that epic, heroic feeling. Another game that I've played a lot in the past is Cyberpunk 2020. It's a bit old now, but the new version, Cyberpunk Red, is out there, so give it a try. So Cyberpunk, what it does, what the mechanics of the game do, is they say it is important to be good at stuff, and you do gradually get better at things, but your hit points are never going to increase. The street is always mean and deadly, and a bullet from a gun can kill pretty much anyone, unless you're actually made of metal. What it also really conveys is that it's not just about doing stuff well, it's about looking cool while doing it. And in fact, in my experience, the only game that has a stat for characters called cool. And those mechanics really allow you to create a mood of dark future with style. One last rule set that I would like to mention is Blades in the Dark. This is a game that tries to convey the feeling of criminals gathering together to plan a heist and then to actually perform it. In fact, the mechanics say, let's skip the planning section and just dive right in, just like in a good heist movie, and you learn about the planning throughout the story with flashbacks. And again, so these are purely game mechanics that allow you to convey a certain mood, which I think is really important when you want to have a game with a certain mood, to think about, hey, which game suits that particular mood the best. And like I said before, that doesn't mean that you cannot create certain moods with any kind of role-playing game, because of course it's possible, but it can help to think about which mechanics will help you to convey that mood. The second thing that really influences the mood of a role-playing game is the setting that it takes place in. And some settings are created for a particular game. Some settings are created rules agnostic, let's say. It doesn't really matter. So let's say the last episode I talked about Dark Sun as an example of a setting for Dungeons and Dragons. And that radically changed the mood of a D&D game. Because suddenly it became more savage, it became more about survival, it became a lot more about the dangers of overusing magic. So there was a lot of mood going on that I hadn't experienced yet in my previous D&D games. And then in that very same rule set of D&D, you can create a gothic horror mood using, for instance, the Ravenloft setting, which my previous guest mentioned. So the mood that a particular setting already creates for you is something that you can use to your advantage when you're trying to go for a certain mood in your games. Call of Cthulhu, for example, can be played in different eras. So the standard era for Call of Cthulhu is the 1920s, which has, of course, a certain mood to it. We're talking about the Roaring Twenties. We're talking about prohibition, mafia or organized crime starting to crop up in the United States, and all sorts of historical details that can really help the keeper of that game to create that mood of the 20s. And the great thing about that, of course, is because it's an actual historical period of our planet Earth, there's a ton of material that you can read and watch and listen to prepare for such games. But you can also play Call of Cthulhu in a different setting, in a different era. So, for instance, Gaslight, which takes place about 30 years before, is completely different in mood, because we're in this Victorian age where we don't have electricity much. We're using gas lights, obviously, and the fashion of the time is different, the behavior of people is different, the occupations that you can have are different, and there are different ways to isolate the characters, which is, of course, great in a horror-type story. And then there's Cthulhu Invictus, which takes place in the Roman era, which is, again, completely different in mood. Another role-playing game that looks like it could do really well when it comes to creating mood through its setting is the Expanse Rpg, which I have here on my bookshelf, and I'm getting ready to try out on some players. Now, this game, the story or the setting of this game, is an ever-escalating conflict between different groups of humans, and as a backdrop, there's stuff happening in space and kind of sci-fi things, but the majority of the setting talks about how these three groups, these three factions of humans interact with each other, and how historically they have been at each other's throats, creating a very interesting political, intrigue-filled mood. Great for all sorts of mysteries and skullduggery. And you can have a great game in that system without ever introducing one of the main bits of the Expanse story, which is the proto-molecule. Now, I'm not going to spoil anything for anyone, so I'm not going to go into what that actually is. But imagine you have the mood of space travel, which includes the anxiety of the absolute danger of the vacuum of space, combined with some political intrigues, combined with the idea that war could be upon us at any time. And then suddenly you introduce this new thing, this proto-molecule, and the mood changes subtly. the mood suddenly shifts towards, okay, yeah, all this space travel, etc., is interesting and kind of scary, but what is going on? What is this protein molecule? What's going to happen? How does the future look? Suddenly, everything is kind of topsy-turvy, which I think is a great element to introduce, not early, but maybe slightly later on in your game, to alter the mood. And this is all still just stuff written in a book mostly, and then we have, of course, the characters, because the players and the characters they choose to play have a huge impact on the mood of a story. Imagine the difference between, if we're talking about a fantasy role-playing game, the difference between a party that has 2 rogues and a fighter and a barbarian, and the same group of players in the same setting, but now they have characters which include a bard and a paladin and 2 clerics. Now, of course, the character class doesn't say everything about the mood, but it does influence things. So if you have religious characters in your game, the mood is going to be slightly different. Also, if you have lots of access to healing, the mood of the game will become a little bit less lethal, perhaps, and a little bit more, well, safe, I guess. Then if you have rogues in your party, of course the mood every now and then is going to be really tense because they're going to be sneaking around on their own at great risk if they get caught. They might be trying to undo very deadly traps. But if you have a game without a rogue, it's also scary in a different way because, well, we don't have somebody who can detect the traps, etc. And maybe the rogues are on the game master's side stealing stuff from the players. So yeah, the characters, and not just their class, but also their backgrounds and the stories of the characters can really impact the mood. One game that springs to mind is I was running a game of The Riddle of Steel, which is a very interesting role-playing game. It has a great mechanic for rewarding players to follow the passions of their characters. And in the outset, we decided, okay, let's have some characters that are free to roam wherever they wish. They are not rich, and they need to kind of make their way in the world. And that sets a certain mood of survival, of being careful who you say what to. There might be countries that have laws about whether or not you can actually bear arms, etc. So the mood of that particular game, I was really getting ready for a story about pretty much normal people like you and me, kind of getting thrust into a situation and having to deal with it, and definitely not having any kind of power over the grander things that happened in the world. But one of the players decided, look, I am not entirely happy with my character concept. I want to change him somewhat. And one of the things that he wanted to change was the social status of the character, which is something you can do in that game. And he decided to play a noble, which meant that suddenly we had a group of player characters that had access to a noble person who was rich, who was influential, who was going to have a castle at some point, and who had an army, who had bodyguards, etc. And the game changed a lot because of it. The game's mood also shifted to something with a bit more politics, with a bit more influence on the warfare, etc., that was going on. And I found it a very interesting shift, to be honest. It wasn't always easy because there was a lot more to manage for me as a keeper or as a game master. And yeah, the players of the other characters also had to shift their idea of, hey, what is my character's place in the world now? Which was very interesting. And it brought up all kinds of questions about, what is it to be noble, and what is it to be powerful, and what is it to not be powerful but to be hanging out with somebody who is, and does that always overshadow you or not? So yeah, the mood of our game completely changed in that regard. So these were all things that relate to the game at large, so the game as a whole, so an entire campaign, let's say. But mood can, of course, be determined for an entire game. I want to create a horror game, or I want to create a very happy game. But within a game, There are different sessions that can have a different mood, and within one session you can have different scenes that have a particular mood, and even within a scene the mood can shift and change, which makes for a more dynamic and interesting game, if you ask me. So now let's zoom in entirely on your game session and what kind of things that you can do to set the mood, to create that feeling that the players will get, oh, this is what's going on, and also to how to change it, to modulate it. So once we're zoomed in entirely on our gaming session, if you're running the game as a game master, then you have a lot of influence on the mood at the table and the mood of what's going on. And a couple of things influence this. One is your choice of words. Now, for me, I'm not a native speaker of English. Sometimes it's hard to find the right words to set the mood exactly. But if you're a native speaker, what you can do, and also, of course, as a non-native speaker, what you can do is you can increase your vocabulary or read a lot of stuff that is about a certain mood to increase that vocabulary, to increase your flexibility of which words you use to describe something. So, for instance, if I want to create a truly horrific scene of somebody getting shot in the face, just something that popped up, I don't know why, then I need to think about what does that look like? What does that feel like? What does it maybe even smell like? And if I want to make it very horrific, then I should really zoom in on the horrific details rather than the technical ones. Because if I just say, well, the guy gets shot in the face and he dies, there's nothing horrific about it except for the idea of somebody dying. However, if I start to describe it with certain words, such as you see bits of bone and cartilage fly away from his face, his eyeball explodes and goo streams down his face, it gets more horrific. And of course, these are just examples. But there are many, many different ways to describe the same thing, different words to describe the same thing that change the tone and the mood. And I've found that when I do it right, when I use the right kind of words, the mood really gets settled in with the players, and you can see some of them really wince at some of the stuff that I say when it's something bad. However, sometimes when I'm at a loss for the right words and I describe it in a more dry, technical way, or even with a small joke, then if I'm trying to create a horrific mood, then it fails utterly. I'm not saying that in a horror game you should constantly be describing horrible things. Definitely not, and we'll get into that in a minute. But choosing the right words is one of the aspects that can really help you set the mood. And the other thing that you have as a narrator or as a storyteller or as a game master is the tone of your voice, right? So during my podcast, I try to speak in an enthusiastic way most of the time because I hope that makes my listeners feel enthusiastic about my content. Which makes perfect sense, I think. During a role-playing game, well, whether I'm a player or a game master, it doesn't really matter. With the mood that I try to convey, I try to reflect that in my voice. So if I want to convey a feeling of darkness, then suddenly I will lower my voice. I will speak more dramatically, etc. Right? So I lower the voice. I use a different register. I might speak a little bit slower, emphasizing all kinds of little bits that I want to. And I might even speak more softly so that at some point I can reach a point where I'm speaking very softly and suddenly, boom, I can create this little jump scare. Other things you can do with your voice is when you're portraying non-player characters, for instance, is to really show their fear of something through their voice. So your player character or an NPC that you're portraying, if you want to make sure that people understand that they are scared of something, it's not enough to just say, well, I'm scared. No. You need to think about, well, what does it sound like when somebody's actually scared? And of course, you can watch all kinds of amazing movies, etc., to get an idea of how to do that. And that's just mood when it comes to the emotions of a character, right? So vocabulary and tone of voice are incredibly important in setting the mood. And I've found that really good players also create a certain mood around their character using a particular voice for their character. I'm not saying we all have to be voice actors that I don't think that's possible for everyone, but you can think of what makes this character unique, and how can I modulate how I speak just a tiny bit to show that. So, for instance, in my latest Call of Cthulhu game, one of the players, his character was from Germany. And so he had a slight German accent in everything he said, and it worked. It created a certain mood around his character. Another thing that I really enjoy doing is using music to set the mood in a certain scene. So, for instance, if I know there's going to be an exciting battle, I will cue up some kind of battle music, and you can use YouTube, or I personally use Spotify, since I also use it to listen to music. And I queue up a few songs that really get that exciting battle feeling going. Usually I pick something from either a computer game or a movie soundtrack, being careful not to choose something too recent or too well known, otherwise people start to think of that particular thing. So music helps, and sound effects can help, but I've found so far that trying to use sound effects, aside from more the soundscape type stuff, but really particular sound effects like a particular hit or explosion, I found that very difficult to do. It distracts me. But some people are great at it, and they use tools like Sirenscape to help them with that. And then there is the room itself in which you play your game. So if we're going to our main mood that we're looking for, which is horror at the moment, there's a lot of things you can do to make the game more scary simply by looking at what can I do with my room. Light is a very important factor. So when we played Call of Cthulhu with some friends the other day, what we did is we dimmed the lights, closed the curtains, and we only had some flickering LED candles. That was the source of light, and that already creates a more dark, scary kind of mood. And on top of that, these candles had this remote control that I can change the color, and they didn't know this until I had a certain scene in which I wanted to use it, and suddenly all the candles turned purple, and it created a little moment of ooh, what's going on? And so that can really help to modulate the mood in your scene. So lights, the table, the dressings of the table, what it all looks like, and of course you can go as far with that as you like. Some people have an entire dungeon below their house to play in, believe it or not. I certainly don't, but I do try to think about what images are on my Dungeon Master screen. I try to think about what does the room look like, and what can I do that is pretty simple to enhance the mood. For instance, during fantasy games, I like to drink from a tankard. It's a silly, simple thing, but it does add something to the mood. And one last thing that I tend to use to improve the mood in a game is props and handouts. So, for instance, in an investigative game, it's great to be able to hand out little newspaper clippings, etc. It really sets the mood of, oh, wow, we're really investigating a mystery here. We're trying to find out what's going on. In one of my fantasy games, the players are trying to collect these pieces of a stone tablet. So what I did is I created those pieces out of foam core and painted them up to look kind of like stone. And whenever they get a new piece, they get really excited. And the mood really changes from the battle scene that they were in to, ooh, we have another piece of the puzzle. Let's see, where does it fit? What does it all mean? And they start thinking and talking about the mystery that they're trying to solve. So that those are handouts and props. It kind of goes hand in hand. So whatever I can do to show what something looks like really helps, again, to set the mood. Now, that's more than enough from me. Let's go to the interview with Scott Dorward. So, welcome to the show, Scott Dorward, one of the 3 presenters of the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast. The first podcast I actually ever listened to, and, I have to say, it got me hooked on the medium. He's also a very successful author and editor of RPG products, many of which are for Call of Cthulhu, such as the amazing Masks of Nyarlathotep campaign. I'm actually glad I managed to say that properly. And if that wasn't enough, he runs regular workshops for writers of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Once again, welcome to the show, Scott.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Wow, excellent. Well, likewise. The main thing of my podcast is that I try to interview people who have done really cool things for the hobby. of role-playing games, and I call them RPG heroes. Yeah, so you're one of them.
Well, thank you. I feel ever so slightly under pressure now.
The bar is high. Absolutely. Yeah, and so like I mentioned, you do quite a lot of things for especially Call of Cthulhu. And one of those things that you do is the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast. So for any of our listeners who have never heard that show, what is it about and what can they expect?
Oh gosh, yes, it's primarily about the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. The whole thing came about about 7 years ago, when my friends Paul Fricker and Matt Sanderson and I had been working together, obviously along with a fair number of other people, on Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. And with that coming out, we were also looking to try to build our careers as freelance writers up a little bit as well, and thought, a bit of publicity might be good. But we also thought that it would simply be fun to do a podcast. We'd listened to a few other gaming podcasts at the time. There were a reasonable number around back then, but nowhere near as many as there are now. And Paul and I in particular had been big fans of the old Sons of Kryos podcast, which was one of the first RPG podcasts, if not the first. And ever since we'd heard that, we'd had the dream of someday doing a podcast. And eventually, all of this kind of hit a critical mass. And we started gathering in Paul's shed and talking about Call of Cthulhu, horror films, weird fiction, other RPGs, but basically all the things that inspired us when we wrote stuff for Call of Cthulhu. And even when we talk about films or books or whatever, we always try to tie it back to Call of Cthulhu and talk about how these things can be inspirational.
Ah, okay. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, so if any of our listeners haven't heard it yet, they should definitely give it a go. For me, it's a great mix of information, so I can learn something, but also entertainment. So the chemistry that the three of you have is very clear that you're good friends and not just colleagues or people who like Call of Cthulhu in general. Yeah. And you mentioned
thank you.
This Sons of Kryos. What I've never heard of it. What is that about?
Oh, gosh.
Does it still exist?
Yeah. No, sadly, it stopped, at least 10 years ago and probably longer. It was a podcast that was done in the US by Judd Kalman and Jeff Lower. Judd Kalman has done a bit of RPG writing. He was responsible for Dictionary of Mu, which I think is one of the best RPG supplements I've ever read. It's a supplement for Sorcerer. And the two of them basically started doing this podcast, which was certainly a big inspiration to how we approach the Good Friends of Jackson Elias, because they did choose, it wasn't a single topic for each episode. They normally have 2 or 3 short ones, but it was some aspect of RPGs that the two of them wanted to debate, and they'd occasionally have other guests on, and they'd just talk about things like GME techniques or techniques for being a better player or sources of inspiration. And it was eye-opening or ear-opening, and it really showed us what the potential for RPG podcasting was back in those early days of podcasts.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Very interesting. And I suppose you can still find it out there somewhere online. The old episodes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, they're all still up on archive.org.
Ah. Okay. Yeah. Great. I'll check it out and definitely link it in the show notes. And so you're writing a lot of stuff for Call of Cthulhu. And so what I understood from you is that you're currently working on or just about finished Flotsam and Jetsam.
Yes. So that's all done. The writing was done a little while back, but it's been released in installments over the last few months. And so this was a campaign that I developed along with a number of other people for the organized play part of Chaosium, the so-called Cult of Chaos.
Yeah, what a great name.
It is, isn't it? So for anyone who hasn't heard of it, this is the program whereby you can sign up free of charge, and if you run Chaosium games in a public venue, so like a game shop or a convention or something like that, they'll give you free materials to run, and you can actually earn rewards from Chaosium, so like free stuff. So it's really worth signing up for. Plus, you get free stuff like Flotsam and Jetsam.
Yeah.
And so, Flotsam and Jetsam is a sort of 4-part, very loose campaign. There are themes that run them all the way through it, and some elements recur. But at the same time, each part can be played independently. So the idea was that, depending on whether you're just running one shots at a game shop or a convention, or whether you want to run a short campaign, you could mix and match and choose as much of it as would suit your group.
Okay. Wow, that sounds great. And do you have to be very experienced as a keeper to join this particular group, or is it?
Not at all.
Oh,
No,
okay.
it is designed to be very friendly for new keepers. And the program itself is designed very much to introduce people to Call of Cthulhu and RuneQuest and other Chaosium products. So the actual campaign and the actual scenarios that they've released as part of this are all very straightforward, with lots of additional help for new keepers.
Right. Oh, that's great. Yeah, because I've only relatively recently started getting into Call of Cthulhu, and part of the reason is that back in the late '90s, when I started playing role-playing games, Call of Cthulhu had a bit of a reputation, let's say, for being that game where people die and go insane all the time.
Yes.
And somehow, people were telling me about it with this big evil grin on their faces, and I thought, well, that doesn't sound fun to me, because I was way more into the let's say the more heroic type games like AD&D. So, what do you think of that? Is because I still hear people say this about Call of Cthulhu, that you're just all gonna die and go insane, and that's it. But there's more to it, right?
Absolutely. So much of it depends on how you approach the game. I mean, different groups play Call of Cthulhu in wildly different ways. So some people are in it for nihilistic horror and making it as grim as possible. And yes, you may have lots of brutal, meaningless death and insanity in that. Other times, people play it very much for black comedy, and it does lend itself quite well to that. I mean, horror and comedy are always very closely intertwined. And with the advent a few years back of Pulp Cthulhu, which is a supplement for Call of Cthulhu, which adds an additional layer on, which allows you to play it in a much more heroic manner, then it's even less of the go mad and die form of Call of Cthulhu, in that it's much more like, say, something like Indiana Jones or the Mummy, so two-fisted adventurers against the forces of the mythos. And if you're looking for a more heroic game or something that's lighter in tone, then I think that may be a good fit.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I guess in the late '90s they hadn't thought of that yet.
Well, I think the first version of Pulp Cthulhu, or at least the first draft of it, started around then.
Oh, really?
That game was in development for something like 20 years.
Oh, wow.
It went through 3 or 4 different writing teams, and there were all sorts of false starts. And it wasn't until Mike Mason took over as the line editor for Call of Cthulhu back just after the 7th edition Kickstarter that he actually managed to finally resurrect the project and get that book put together.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So for any of our listeners out there who think, well, I'd like to give it a try, but I prefer Indiana Jones over, let's say, Lovecraft, and that could be a good idea to try. And in fact, the first proper game of Call of Cthulhu that I ran as a keeper was one of your scenarios, which was Blackwater Creek. Yeah.
Aha, yes.
And I used it to introduce people to the game.
Well, that's actually what it was written for in the first place, because I was one of the editors of Call of Cthulhu 7th edition, and we, the idea was initially that Blackwater Creek would go into the core rulebook, but there was so much stuff in the core rulebook by the time we finished putting it together that we had to cut whole chunks of it out. So that went into the keeper's screen, and we ended up removing the story of the Call of Cthulhu and the classic, the Haunting, the original sort of Call of Cthulhu scenario, which is now in the Quick Start rules. And so, yes, that's why, I'm sure you saw when you read it, that it's
Yeah.
got all sorts of additional box text in there for new keepers to explain, here's how you use the mechanics to handle this bit and so
Yeah.
on. So, yeah, I hope it was an easy game for you to run as your first experience.
I have to say, yeah, it was. And I was happily surprised by all these boxes that actually told me, hey, if you're worried about this, you can try this, or if this happens, then it might be smart to do that. That was really helpful. And what I liked a lot about it is I've seen quite a lot of modules that kind of tell you this is the story from A to B to C, and then here's the end, D. And what I liked is that this scenario allowed me to say, well, where do you want to go? B is fine, C is fine. You'll find hints to D if you go to there, etc. So it allowed the players some freedom to roam around in this crazy town, and well, I have to say we enjoyed it, and we had one death and one permanent insane person, so it was not too bad.
Nice.
Yeah, but we enjoyed it, and they keep asking me when are we going to play again. So that
Good.
I think it worked. Yeah. Right. So, and that particular scenario takes me to the first kind of main question that I have, which is also one of the main topics of this episode, which is mood in a role playing game. Because what struck me in this scenario is that there are some flavor text that you can read out that really set the mood. And then after that, it's really up to the keeper and the players to keep that mood going or to change it as you like. How do you create a certain mood in a game? What's your
Oh, that is actually a very, very tricky thing. One of the hardest parts of creating mood in a horror game is that everyone has to buy into it. Everyone has to want the same mood out of it. Because if you have four people around the table who are really into horror, who are trying to make this as scary and creepy as possible, trying to let themselves get scared, and you've got one person sitting there making jokes on the way through, then it's going to kill any mood that you build up. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with making all the jokes on the way through. That is an entirely valid way of playing it, and I've played a lot of fun games with people who do that. But you have to make sure that that's what everyone else wants out of the game. Having discussions with the players ahead of time about what kind of mood you're going for always helps. Even then, it sometimes doesn't. I remember one of the most successful attempts I had at building mood was a convention game many years ago, actually using a game called Dead of Night, where I said to the players initially, I want to try to run this as psychological horror. It's meant to be very nihilistic. Fundamentally, it's a game about hopelessness, and your characters are not going to get out of this alive. And so, I want to play this as a sort of descent into hell and destruction. And there was a little bit of resistance at first. I mean, everyone bought into the idea, but for the first hour of the game, people were making the usual kind of jokes, and there were the usual releases of tension. And then about an hour into it, I don't know what happened. It was just like everyone suddenly aligned and realized, oh, hang on, this is what we want out of the game. And from there on, it just became absolutely nightmarish in all the right ways. And I think it's one of the most successful horror games I've had. But the important thing was that everyone had bought into that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That sounds really good, because I tried, with this scenario to create a certain atmosphere, and I did all kinds of kind of more gimmicky things, I suppose, to set the mood, such as I had these LED candles that flicker and they change color when I press a button, and I had some music going on, which helped, I think, to a certain extent. But what helped me the most was the fact that all the players were they were fans of Lovecraft, first of all, and they like horror, and
good.
But also they seem to really go for it with the insanity and with the being creeped out as characters. And yeah, I was lucky. I think these were all people who never played a role-playing game in their life.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I was amazed. Yeah,
yeah,
definitely going back to that.
Well, Well, I sometimes find they're the best people to game with because they haven't got into a lot of the bad habits that some gamers have.
Yeah, that's true. Because some people who have played a lot, they can become a bit jaded. They go, it's
Mm.
another game, another character. Let's roll some dice. What's my best skill? That kind of thing. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
But also, as far as building mood is concerned, I mean, there's all sorts of other things you can do. I mean, yeah, I've done a lot of the things you've mentioned there in terms of lighting and mood music and even burning incense and
Oh, yeah.
stuff like that, just to try to create an interesting setting.
Hmm.
But a lot of it, I think, does come down to narration. And when I say narration, I mean, it's not just the things you say, but the way you say it. I mean,
Hmm.
that you can do a lot just with tone of voice.
Yeah.
Speaking quietly and slowly during tense moments kind of really helps build up atmosphere. And then suddenly, having sudden starts and changing the pace suddenly. I mean, I'm not above shouting, screaming, banging things on the table and so on to get jump scares in tense moments.
Cool.
Similarly, the way things, rather, the kinds of things you say are also very important. I just trying to describe things as vividly, or at least as viscerally as possible. I mean, this can be horrific things. Um, I think it helps a lot as well with fight scenes, for example, to narrate violence as something brutal in a game like Call of Cthulhu. So instead of you've just lost 5 hit points, it's the club impacts with your face. You feel something go crunch inside there, and suddenly your vision is skewed as you realise one of your eyeballs is dangling out of the socket. That's going to be a bit more memorable.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And when you're describing monsters or creepy places or creepy people, then describing them using the full range of senses helps a lot as well. So you don't just describe the way things look, but for example, in Blackwater Creek, a lot of it is about the way everything smells.
Yeah, that pervasive smell. Yeah. And I remember the players getting kind of, in the beginning, I mentioned that smell a few times, and then at some point they caught on, and they're like, "What is this?" And then they started to mistrust everything. They didn't want to drink or eat anything, etc. Yeah, and then spoilers, but yeah.
And yes, sound and touch and everything. I just describe everything in terms of all the senses you got available to you.
Yeah.
It's something that you build up as a skill over time.
Yeah.
But certainly, reading horror fiction or fiction in which weird things happen helps. Building up the vocabulary to do that, but most importantly, being able to visualize it to yourself and describe what you're seeing and build that word picture for the other people at the table. If you can do that, that will take you a long way.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems for people like me who are not actually native speakers of English, is that it's a language thing, and I find this stuff really doesn't work in Dutch. Dutch is a very very dry language. If you compare vocabulary, the size of the dictionary of English is maybe, I don't know, 5 times bigger than Dutch.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, that's not just Dutch. That's every language. I mean, English being a combination of, so many linguistic roots and having absorbed loan words from every country around the world. Yeah, our vocabulary is, I'd say, 2 to 5 times the size of any other language out there.
Yeah. And that's, I think, why it works so well for fiction and also for role-playing games. But then you run into the problem of either it's my vocabulary that's lacking, or I say something and half the players are like, what does that mean? Yeah. But and so talking about mood and making things scary, so horror role-playing games, one of the things that I find very difficult is that if you describe things well, you can the players can intellectually understand that their character would be afraid, but getting that real sense of fear, that I haven't really managed that yet. I've managed people to worry, is my character going to survive, but not this the goosebumps and all these kind of things. Is that at all possible, you think, or?
It's a very rare thing, and I think it's something that realistically you shouldn't worry too much about. The comparison I make is I don't think I know too many long-term horror fans who are really scared by horror films. I know a few,
Hmm.
but most horror fans I know, people who've grown up watching horror films since they were a kid, are not generally scared when they go and see a horror film at the cinema or watch it at home, but they still enjoy it.
Yeah.
There's something about the imagery and the ideas and the vocabulary of horror that speaks to them. And yeah, this still makes it an effective genre, even if you don't evoke fear. It still evokes a certain kind of thrill. And I think that's enough. And that said, I mean, occasionally you will scare someone. It's
Hmm.
a completely unpredictable thing. I mean, I have been told by one player, for example, that a game I ran for him gave him nightmares. And
Oh.
I choose to take that as a good thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
a couple of times I have made players just jump at the table.
Hmm.
Um, the most memorable one, it was quite odd. It was actually in a very uncreepy atmosphere. It was in a convention in the
Hmm.
middle of a fairly crowded gaming hall
Oh, wow.
with other games
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
But I was describing the player characters were this group of kids who were breaking into this abandoned factory where they believed weird things were happening. And one of the players was talking about his character sneaking up to a window to see whether there was any movement inside and brushing the dust away and just sneaking a look inside the darkness there.
Yeah.
And when I'm running games at conventions, I tend to do it while standing up and I walk around the table.
Hmm.
And so as he did this, I sort of described him standing on these teetering crates and creaking underfoot, and him wiping the dust and cobwebs out of the way and putting his hands up to the window and just looking inside. And then I just leaned down very suddenly, almost nose to nose to him, and said,
Oh.
"There's a face."
Oh.
and he almost jumped out of the chair.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good idea, actually, walking around, because I find I generally do my keeping or my game mastering sitting down because I have so many notes and things going on.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, it's easier possibly because I tend to improvise a lot
Hmm. Yeah.
when I game, so I very rarely refer to notes. I generally only have notes there to remind me about names and character relationships.
All right. Yeah.
But yeah, when I'm running games at conventions, I tend to run a lot of games when I'm at a convention, and it can be quite tiring. So I tend to stand up and walk around just as a way of keeping myself alert.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I see what you mean. Generally, during the daytime, I'm a teacher, and I find if I sit down while I teach, there's nowhere near the same energy. Let's say that when
Mm,
compared to when I'm walking around the classroom. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, it's exactly the same. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And some students consider that to be horror. So. Uh, yeah, and so when you when I consider playing Call of Cthulhu, I'm much more likely to use a written scenario than when I'm playing, let's say, Dungeons and Dragons. And one of the reasons is that because it's an investigative game. So you said you improvise a lot, but how do you
Mm.
manage that when there's so many little details to consider in an investigative game?
Well, there are a number of aspects to my answer to this.
Mm,
I when I run games that I'm developing, which is mostly what I do these days,
mm,
I generally start from a very rough set of notes and ideas. So when I'm running a game at a convention or running it online as an early playtest, it's rare that I've got more than, say, a page full of bullet points at this stage.
oh,
That is the scenario. So it's not like I'm having to remember lots of
mm,
details. What, I've got the most important details of the structure there, and things like character relationships and clues and bangs and stuff like that plotted out,
yeah.
but the rest of it I will just make up as I go along.
Mm,
And that for me is an important part of the development process, because by the time I've done that a few times, I've developed a sort of set of ideas I know works around the general framework.
mm,
And some of the things I'll have jettisoned because I've discovered they haven't worked. other things have worked in different ways than I thought. So, I've changed them on the fly. So, then when I go back and flesh all that out and write it up, it's based on all those bits that I made up on the spot.
Right.
But yeah, with Call of Cthulhu, I mean, there is this whole idea that it is an investigative game, and it is sort of set that template in horror gaming ever since, in that the majority of horror games that people play now, because of Call of Cthulhu, are investigative.
Yeah.
My dirty secret as a Call of Cthulhu writer is that I don't actually like investigative games very much.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I very rarely approach writing Call of Cthulhu scenarios as investigations. I will put clues in there and horrible discoveries the players can make, but I was much more influenced by the sort of indie games of the early 2000s. In particular, I mean, there were two things that really influenced me. One was a scenario that was written about 20 years ago for Unknown Armies by Greg Stolze, called Jailbreak. And it is a traditional scenario. It's sort of an investigative scenario, but it is structured in a very sort of non-traditional way, or at least non-traditional for the time, in that it just sort of presents a situation and a bunch of problems and things that happen, and it's expected that the player characters will react to those and learn things in the process. And so it's not like, here's a clue, here's a clue, here's a clue. It's sort of, here's a problem, here's an escalating problem, here's an escalating problem.
Right.
And the other influence was an old friend of mine, Malcolm Craig, wrote this fantastic game called Hot War, which I wrote a few things for. And he, in the games that he developed, hammered home the idea that we weren't writing scenarios, we were writing what he described as situations. And so you'd create a situation in which the player characters would find themselves, a set of circumstances they'd have to deal with, again, emergent problems, escalating situations. And it wasn't just a trail of clues. You go here, you learn this. You have a few options from the stage. You go off and you perhaps follow this particular clue, learn such and such, and it all eventually builds towards a climax. Instead, it was there is something really horrible happening here. Yes, there are things you can learn, but at the same time, there are moral choices you've got to make. There's survival aspects of it. There's sort of just an escalating sense of wrongness that you've got to deal with. And I find that a much more compelling way of writing Call of Cthulhu scenarios. So it's very rare when I'm sitting down to write one that I think of it in terms of an investigation. I tend to think of it in terms of what problems can I hit the investigators with.
Yeah. And then it's up to them to decide, do I want to actually find out what's going on?
Exactly.
Do I run for my life? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and the other advantage of that solution is I found with a lot of investigative games, I've been playing Call of Cthulhu for almost as long as Call of Cthulhu has been around, and a lot of those early scenarios were of variable quality. There were some really great ones that really defined what role-playing scenarios and campaigns could be like Masks from the Nyarlathotep. But there were an awful lot that made assumptions about what the player characters would do. They will go to X location, they'll do such and such to find the clue, then this will lead them to such and such a place, and then this will all lead to a scripted climax where this will happen. And they've been given all the pieces, they've been given the ritual to do once they get to this location to stop the evil cult from doing whatever they're doing. And obviously this is what's going to happen. And my experience, it took far too long for me to learn this lesson as a GM, but my experience was that scenarios like that were usually exercises in frustration because players wouldn't always do the predictable thing. In fact, more often than not, they wouldn't. And if you were trying to get to that scripted climax, because of course you were, because that's what the whole scenario was building towards, you'd either have to railroad them in towards doing that or completely rewrite the scenario on the fly. And I figured, if you're writing Call of Cthulhu scenarios now, and I think most people do this now, is you don't make those assumptions anymore that if you do have a scripted climax, then it's an optional thing and there's other ways that the player characters can get to it, and there isn't a prescribed solution. I think it's important to let players come up with their own solutions. You don't just give them the ritual to perform when they get there, because that's just boring. You get them to the climactic situation. You give them a problem, and it's up to their creativity to find a way to solve it.
Yeah. Oh, that really helps, because I have to say that I found the idea daunting of creating my own scenario for Call of Cthulhu. Simply because of the amount of layers and little details if you want to do a very investigative game. And I thought, wow, I found it a difficult premise. But when you put it like that, it's more of a situation that you create, and good luck with it to the players. That sounds very different. Yeah, because even though the players in my game of Blackwater Creek, they spend a lot of time investigating, kind of. They're trying to figure out what's going on and where is such and such, and at the same time, so they set out with this missing person that they want to find, but they don't have to go to each location. And in fact, I think one of the most climactic locations, let's say, let's not spoil it for everyone, but you don't have to go there at all. And and the funny thing is,
that was that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that was a very deliberate design choice, in that I wanted there to be any number of ways that scenario could end depending on what the players found interesting. And I'm very much of the opinion that it's absolutely okay for player characters to fail. And if they head off to Blackwater Creek in search of Henry Rhodes, and they don't find him, or they find some doom that meets them before they ever find out what happened to him, as long as the players had fun, as long as they find that climax satisfying, that's fine.
Yeah. In our case, one of the players shot him in the head.
Nice.
Yeah, it felt terrible for the guy. He's like, he cannot be helped. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was an interesting scene. Nobody else was there. They were all upstairs, and everybody just looked at him like, "You do what?" Yeah.
Perfect.
It was a great moment. Yeah, a lot of fun. Great. And so we talked a bit about investigative games or horror, mood, etc. You've shed a little bit of light on how you actually create a scenario. So do you often start with, let's say, a Lovecraftian creature or thing in mind, or not at all?
Very rarely. I have a few times, because there are certain Lovecraftian monsters I particularly like and I wanted to investigate in different ways. But on the whole, no. I don't have any one method I use for creating a scenario. And, quite often I'll just start with the germ of an idea, and I'll just build upon that, and I'll make notes in my notebooks and see where it takes me. And, sometimes I'll have a completely different idea and I'll realize the two mesh together quite nicely, or I'll read something, a news article or a magazine article, and that'll give me an idea that I realize fits with whatever it is I'm working on and takes it in a new direction. So, for example, when I was writing Blackwater Creek, I had no idea what it was at first. Initially, it was going to be something about a lake monster and a fishing community, and it just sort of evolved from there. But the lake monster idea is sort of there. There is a thing that you find in a body of water at some stage, which was originally going to be sort of the main thing going on in the scenario. And I realized as I was writing it, well, actually, no, that's almost incidental. What's more important is how that thing came to be. And it just turned into something completely different. So, but as far as exploring the canon mythos entities and creatures. Yeah, I mean, it's fun to have that toolkit, but I think it's also a lot of fun to create your own and create your own spin on things, because I think it's something that a lot of Call of Cthulhu GMs and sometimes writers forget, which is, all these things that we're playing with, all these toys in the toy box, were all things that were created by other writers. And it was a very deliberate thing. Lovecraft was sort of one of the original open source creators. When he created the Cthulhu mythos, he opened it up as a playground for all his other friends, and they exchanged ideas. People like Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith and Robert Bloch and August Derleth and all the other people he was corresponding with at the time. And they all created their own entities and chipped in bits and used each other's entities in their stories. And as it went on, more writers, the next generation of writers, did the same. They built upon Lovecraft's entities but added their own ones and new complications, and sometimes took things in completely different directions. And I don't see as much of that in the RPG side of things. I think, too often we are beholden to the things that other people have created, and I think we should be much more willing just to make our own stuff up. So this was one of the reasons why I pitched the idea of this collection, Nameless Horrors, to Matt and Paul many years ago, which was a scenario collection that ended up being part of the Call of Cthulhu 7th edition Kickstarter. And there were a few sort of design restrictions or constraints that we placed on ourselves when writing that. One was we couldn't use any entities that had appeared in any other stories or mythos scenarios. They were all original creation. They were nameless horrors. That they were all playable as self-contained one-shots, because I feel that Call of Cthulhu is at its best, or its most frightening, when it feels like a horror film, when it is something self-contained.
Yeah.
And that the other thing was that that none of the scenarios had violence as an obvious solution. That's not to say there wouldn't be fight scenes in them, but it wouldn't be a case of roll up with shotguns and dynamite or whatever and kill the monster. That the situation was going to be more complicated than that. And so, we had a lot of fun doing that, and it really did reinforce for me the idea that creating your own entities or creating your own gods or whatever is very much an underutilized and important part of Call of Cthulhu.
Okay, sounds like good advice. And so the one of the players in my Blackwater Creek game, he actually, when it was over, he said, okay, so now I want to find this guy who started all this.
Oh, yes.
So I think we have a wonderful seed there for a scenario.
I have actually written a follow-up scenario investigating that. So it hasn't been published yet.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I'm gonna keep an eye out for that one then. Any idea when that's coming out, or?
No, I don't. But
okay.
I shall make some announcements at the time. Though I probably won't actually mention which scenario it is at the time, because the fact that it is linked to Blackwater Creek is a bit of a spoiler. I think it's
okay.
it's probably better to discover that by yourself.
Fair enough. Yeah, we won't tell anyone. Except for I don't know. I think my previous episode had something like 130 people listening to it. So,
wow, for a first couple of episodes, that's really actually damn good.
Yeah,
I think it took us about a year of the Good Friends to reach that kind of number.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I was helped a lot by my first guest on the first episode, Runehammer, or Hankerin Fernale. He posted some stuff on his Facebook page about the interview, and suddenly I saw on that date a huge spike. So people listen to him, I think.
Fantastic.
Yeah, we're really lucky in that sense. Yeah, and I think that kind of neatly takes us to back to the beginning, which is, this is called RPG Heroes, this podcast. And I'm very curious when I talk to people who I consider to be very valuable members of the RPG community. Who do you look up to, or who do you revere as a hero in this wonderful world of role playing games?
Gosh, I mean, there are so many possibilities here, and there are
Mm.
all sorts of people whose work has influenced me. I mentioned, Greg Stolze's Jailbreak a little while back, and other things he's written have been, hugely influential. Um, I think of people like Greg Stafford and Sandy Peterson, without whom there wouldn't be Call of Cthulhu.
Mm.
Greg Stafford in particular, he created so many fantastic games during his life, ranging from things like RuneQuest, which forms the basis of Call of Cthulhu,
Yeah.
and even the Ghostbusters RPG, which is great fun and was, I think, the first RPG to use a dice pool. It was quite revolutionary.
Oh, really?
Mechanics.
Oh.
Yeah.
Mm.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he was a real innovator. And so I was initially going to choose Greg Stafford, and then I had a last minute change of heart just as we were starting recording. And I thought I'd go for someone less well known, who's actually an old friend of mine, whose work I think is criminally overlooked, because I think he is one of the most interesting RPG designers I've come across. It's a man called James Mullin. We've known each other for about 20 years. We both, like a number of other RPG writers I know, started out at the Milton Keynes Role Playing Club. And James is one of the most creative RPG designers I've ever encountered. He is able to come up with unique sets of mechanics, almost on a daily basis.
Wow.
And he's self-published a number of games. He's won a few awards for them, richly deserved. But I don't think he gets anywhere near the recognition he deserves. And it's not just that, but he's also fantastic at running these games. He is a fixture of the convention scene in the UK, and his games are always massively popular. I remember, just to give you some example, one time he didn't have an idea for what he was going to run in a game slot. There was a game slot that needed an additional game in it, and someone said, "James, can you run something?" And he's, "Oh yeah, all right." And he had no idea what to do, so he just put up a sign-up sheet just with his name on it. No name, no game description, no pitch, nothing like that, and it filled up in about 2 minutes.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. And so what would be a game that I might have heard of that he created?
So he won, I think, was it the Game Chef, or it was one Indie Games Award, with a game called Never to Die, which is a group about a sort of boys' night out that goes horribly wrong. And basically you have certain archetypal male friends who wind each other up in certain ways, and they all sort of end up getting into trouble with the law, or getting themselves seriously injured or killed just on their laddish escapades. And it is just fantastic. He's written another game called Blood and Water, which is it started off as his answer to, did you ever see the TV series Being Human? About a werewolf, a vampire, and a ghost sharing a flat in London. Not in London.
Yes.
Bristol, I think. Yeah.
I think I have seen it. Yeah.
And so he sort of did this game, which was very much a combination of the supernatural and kitchen sink drama, and he's put a number of different skins on there, and it is a very British game in the way that it sort of combines that sort of weird nastiness with the very, very painfully mundane.
That sounds great. I'll definitely look for those and link to some of those in the show notes. Great. Well, it sounds like a proper RPG hero to me. Somebody who's created so many different things and is also able to just come up with new things just like that. That's wonderful. Okay, great. Well, I think we've kind of reached a point where I can just say thank you so incredibly much for taking the time out to appear on the show. And if if I ever come up with another topic for my show that involves horror in some kind of way, I'd love to have you on again if that's possible.
Oh, yes, it'd be my pleasure.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Scott.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been delightful.
Well, that was another RPG hero, and what a wonderful interview that was. Thank you so much, Scott, once again, for all the things that you've shared with me today. And, well, that kind of brings us towards the end of the episode. I feel like I've learned a lot from this particular RPG hero, especially about a game that I'm not super familiar with yet, Call of Cthulhu, and with the techniques for creating better horror in my games in general. So, my players in different games that I run, beware. All right. So, yeah, let's wrap it up. Well, that's it for episode 3. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed recording. If you did, please consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. It really helps to get the podcast get heard. Want to keep up with the latest news about my podcast? Then hop on over to my Facebook page on facebook.com/RPG Heroes Podcast. Check out the full show notes with all the links at rpgheroes.buzzsprout.com. Want to support the show and join other supporters on my Discord channel? Then I would be honored if you check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/RPGheroes. 2 weeks from now, I'll be delving into settings for RPGs with the help of the creator of the D&D setting, Eberron, Keith Baker. Until next time, stay heroic.